Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 764, and today is February 28th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We have a lot of news to get through on today's show, so I'm going to jump right into it. First, I just want to remind people we are holding our fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. So if you want to make sure that I could continue to produce this show and all the other work I do, head on over to the Institute and make a donation today. All right. Starting off here with this one from Dave DeCamp on February 26th at antiwar.com. House passes budget resolution that will increase military spending by $100 billion. So it looks like all those ambitious Doge cuts are not going to really do anything at the Pentagon, where we're going to flood even more money into America's most corrupted bureaucracy. So, House Republicans on Tuesday passed a budget blueprint that would raise military spending by $100 billion, a plan that is backed by President Trump, despite a suggestion that Pentagon spending could be cut. The budget plan also extends $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, will add $3 trillion to the deficit, and raise the debt ceiling by $4 trillion. It passed the party lines in a vote of 217 to 215, with Representative Thomas Massie being the only Republican to vote against it. Explaining his opposition, Massie cited the increase in the deficit. He said, or wrote on X, if the Republican budget passes, the deficit gets worse, not better. So the Senate recently passed its own resolution that will increase military spending by $150 billion, but didn't include the tax cuts. Trump has said he wants the budget plan and tax cuts to be put together into one big, beautiful bill, backing the House's version. Representative Mike Rogers, a Republican from Alabama, chairs the House Armed Services Committee, said the extra $100 billion in military spending could be used to secure the southern border, among other things. $100 billion in this spending resolution will enable us to begin restoring American deterrence, prioritizing lethality, and ensuring peace through strength. So when the Republican senators introduced their version of the budget plan, they said the increase in military spending could be used to fund President Trump's idea for an Iron Dome for America, a military defense project that will come with a huge price tag and likely start a new arms race. Now, update on the National Endowment for Democracy. The NED confirms its funding has been suspended, forcing it to halt all partner support. So the NED, a U.S.-funded organization that meddles in elections and pushes regime change around the world in the name of spreading democracy, has confirmed reports that its funding from the U.S. government has been frozen, forcing it to suspend operations. The NED said in a statement on Tuesday, the NED is currently unable to access its congressionally appropriated funds, which sustain nearly all of its grant-making and operations. As a result, for the first time in the organization's 4-decade history, it has been unable to meet its obligations and has been forced to suspend support for nearly 2,000 partners nationwide. While the NED, presents itself as an independent organization, it's nearly entirely funded by the U.S. government, which it acknowledged in the statement. The NED claims its funds should have been exempt from the Trump administration's pause on foreign aid. The statement from NED said, 95% of NED's funding is directly appropriated by Congress and is not considered foreign assistance. This funding, therefore, was not subject to the executive order freezing foreign assistance for the 90-day review. However, despite being exempt, access to these funding has been inexplicably cut off, forcing NED to halt all of its partner support and furlough the majority of its staff. The NED, which was founded during the Cold War in 1983, received $315 million from the U.S. government for fiscal year 2025. In 1991, Alan Weinstein, a co-founder of NED, acknowledged to the Washington Post that a lot of what the organization did was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. In the 1991 article, the Washington Post column David Ignatius listed some examples of NED's overt action that was previously done by the CIA, including providing money and moral support for pro-democracy groups, training resistance fighters, and working to subvert communist rule. The NED has been targeted by Elon Musk, who asked his followers in a recent X post to list all the evil things that the NED has done. James Bovard, a senior fellow at the Libertarian Institute, replied with an article about how he's been critical of the organization for 40 years. In a 2009 article for the Future of Freedom Foundation, Bovard said the NED is based on the notion that its meddling in foreign elections is automatically pro-democracy because the U.S. government is the incarnation of democracy. NED has always operated on the principle that what's good for the U.S. government is good for democracy. In a 2006 piece for the American Conservative, Bovard detailed NED's efforts to push regime change in Latin America. He wrote, in 2001, NED quadrupled its aid to Venezuela opposition of election President Hugo Chavez, and NED heavily funded some organizations involved in a bloody military coup that temporarily removed Chavez from power in April 2002. Bovard continues, after Chavez retook control, NED and the State Department responded by pouring even more money into groups seeking his ouster. The International Republican Institute, one of the largest NED grant recipients, played a key role in both the Chavez coup and the overthrow of Haiti's elected president Aristide in 2004. An array of NED-aided groups and individuals helped spur an uprising that left 100 people dead and toppled the Haitian government. So a lot of nefarious stuff going on from the NED. I also find it amazing that the U.S. has an organization which we give money to, which then gives monies to other organizations. If the Congress wanted other organizations to add that money, why doesn't it go straight from Congress to those organizations? All right, so Trump to cut 90% of USAID contracts, fire more staffers. So a memo circulating in the Trump administration says the president plans to eliminate 90% of USAID's foreign aid programs. An official in the agency said there are many more terminations coming. The AP reported the outlet obtained an internal memo from the administration that outlined the planned cuts to 90% of USAID contracts, or $60 billion. So the AP wrote, in all, the Trump administration says it will eliminate 5,800 of the 6,200 multi-year USAID contracts awards for a cut of $54 billion. Another 4,100 of the 9,100 State Department grants were also being eliminated for a cut of $4.4 billion. The memo states officials were clearing significant waste stemming from decades of institutional drift, and that the changes are geared to use U.S. taxpayer dollars wisely to advance American interest. So after taking office last month, Trump ordered a 90-day freeze on all foreign aid programs, and now appears most of these frozen programs will be shut down. Additionally, Trump announced the remainder of the USAID will be absorbed into the State Department. The downsizing of the agency has led many employees to losing their jobs. A USAID official warned the remaining employees to expect more terminations in the near future. There are many more terminations coming, so please gear up, a USAID official wrote to the agency staff on Monday. While USAID programs are often presented as helping desperate people receive basic services, the agency has been deployed by Washington to foment dissent and facilitate regime change operations. And so just like the NED, this is a good thing that its funding is being stripped. Now on to some bad news. Mike Pompeo lands a new job at Columbia teaching diplomacy. So, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is now a fellow at Columbia's Institute for Global Politics, where he will teach diplomacy. According to the Wall Street Journal, Pompeo was hired by the university to teach diplomacy, decision making, and organizational leadership. The hire was presented as an attempt to expand the school's diversity of thought. So, Corinne Yahir Milo, the dean of Columbia School of International Public Affairs, said, "The academy cannot be an ivory tower. We should engage with the world because we learn a lot from engaging with practitioners with differing positions and ideologies who also ultimately can learn from us." Pompeo's remarks on the hiring were, "I suspect that Columbia's outreach was intentional in the sense that they were looking to bring into campus someone with a view that is very different from most of the faculty on their staff." Pompeo is a Zionist who advocates for robust U.S. support for Israel. Columbia was once one of the most active locations for the campus protest movement in 2024, which saw thousands of students demand an end to the Israeli genocide in Gaza. At the time, Pompeo smeared the activists as violent pro-Hamas mob threatening and attacking Jewish students. Pompeo currently sits on the board of directors at Cybara, a firm founded by two Israelis who served in an IDF information warfare unit. The company claims to scan social media and identify fake profiles. After Israel invaded Gaza, Cybara claimed that 1 in 4 accounts engaging in discussion about the war were fake accounts amplifying pro-Hamas views. Cybara worked for ads after Elon Musk acquired the company in 2022. The State Department also hired the Israeli firm to scan 30,000 profiles. Cybara reported that 33% of the discourse was fake, asserting the accounts were attempting to discredit criticisms of the Chinese government. The company, Pompeo said, is a tool to identify threats to our democratic institutions. He explained, "Cybara's efforts are not only safeguarding our digital realm, but also strengthening the foundations of free and fair discourse. Cybara's contributions are invaluable in the fight against malicious actors who seek to undermine our democratic institutions." And so I find it, this is probably the most interesting part, right? This is an Israeli firm that is amplifying the narrative of the Israeli government, helping to discredit all opposition to Israel as pro-Hamas bots and things like that. And if you look when it came to the State Department, suddenly they're finding accounts that are pro-China because that's what the State Department is paranoid about. And so I think it's clear that this is just a tool, and who knows if the tool even actually functions, but that the tool is used to generate reports that undermine narratives counter to the prevailing Washington foreign policy establishment. And so while Pompeo's hiring is presented as something out of line with the typical thought at Columbia University, I think, with maybe a few exceptions, that this is right in with the typical thinking at Columbia University. So while Pompeo billed his and Cybara's work as noble, he previously bragged that "I was CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole." The agency has an infamous legacy of conducting influence operations even inside the U.S. Pompeo largely expressed his views in line with the Washington consensus on foreign policy, including other Columbia professors such as Hillary Clinton and Victoria Nuland. Now, there are a couple Columbia University professors who actually write articles for antiwar.com, or we reprinted antiwar.com, who do have sensible views on foreign policy. I'm thinking of Jeffrey Satz and Joe Twillinger. So, I just finished up the article here by mentioning that Pompeo has called on Washington to take an aggressive posture for the proxy war in Ukraine, pushing for the U.S. to offer Kiev a $500 billion lend-lease program to keep the Ukrainian forces armed and on the battlefield. And so he is certainly an advocate of extending that conflict. All right, next up, this is one of our other contributors at antiwar.com. Canadian author Yves Engler, released after 5 days in jail for pro-Palestinian social media posts. So Engler, a prominent Canadian author and activist, was released from jail on Monday after spending 5 days behind bars for social media posts that were critical of an outspoken supporter of Israel. Last Tuesday, Engler, a contributor to antiwar.com, was contacted by Montreal police to inform him that he would be arrested for comments he made on X in replies to a post from Delia Kurtz, a pro-Israeli activist and a staunch supporter of the genocidal war that Israel has waged on Gaza. After being contacted by police, Engler shared the news that he would be arrested for calling her a genocide supporter and a fascist in response to her racist, violent, anti-Palestinian post. Engler said Kurtz frequently calls for state violence against those challenging Canadian complicity in the genocide. Kurtz claimed that Engler was harassing her even though her posts were public, and X has a feature that allows users to block other users. Kurtz has chosen not to block me, but instead pursue criminal charges, Engler said. So after writing about his situation and getting thousands of supporters to call for the charges to be dropped, the Montreal police then claimed Engler was harassing them and trying to interfere in a police investigation and tacked on extra charges. Engler said, angry at receiving emails in my defense, the police were seeking to release conditions barring me from discussing the charges leveled against me. The police are now claiming I'm victimizing them. After being hit with new charges, Engler was in prison for 5 days until he saw a judge on Monday and released on bail. He is due back in court near the end of April. So Engler said in a statement following his release, rather than devoting policing and judicial resources to harassing critics of Israeli violence, the police and the Crown should be pursuing Canadians who have been fighting in the Israeli military for potentially violating Canada's Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. While he is still to appear in court, Engler said the terms of his release were a victory for free speech because there are no restrictions on his ability to discuss the charges against him. The judge effectively forced the Crown to drop its bid to muzzle me, he explained. Engler said the Crown should immediately drop all charges against me, apologize, and to compensate me for my imprisonment. In an interview with Middle East Eye, Engler said his arrest was a part of a larger crackdown on free speech in Canada meant to discourage pro-Palestinian activism. Less than 2 weeks ago, I spoke on a webinar with a lawyer from British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, and it was titled The New McCarthyism in Canada. It was all about the targeting of those opposing Canada's complicity in Israel's apartheid and genocide. We went through a whole bunch of examples of people who have been targeted. Canada has for more than a century provided all kinds of support for Zionism and for Palestinian dispossession. The targeting of those opposing Israel's crimes is just one of the innumerable ways that Canada has assisted in Palestinian dispossession. Throughout his career, Engler has been a staunch critic of Canadian foreign policy and Canada's support for Israel, including a 2010 book entitled Canada and Israel, Building Apartheid. He's also been a very astute critic of Canada's role in supporting the U.S. empire and other ventures, including the war in Ukraine. All right, so next up here, this one I wrote for the Institute on February 26th. Trump returns to maximum pressure policy against Venezuela. So President Donald Trump announced that he would reimpose all sanctions from his first administration on Venezuela. President Joe Biden granted some companies temporary license to do business in Venezuela in an effort to improve ties with Caracas. So Trump wrote on Truth Social, "We are hereby revising the concessions that crooked Joe Biden gave to Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela on the oil transaction agreement dated November 26, 2022. I am therefore ordering that the ineffective and unmet Biden concession agreement be terminated as of March 1st. option to renew. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So during Trump's first administration, he significantly stepped up pressure and sanctions on Venezuela, a policy known as maximum pressure. Additionally, he backed a coup attempt by Juan Guaido against President Nicolas Maduro. The Biden administration made some effort to warm ties with Caracas with no notable success. In October of 2023, the Biden administration lifted some sanctions on Venezuela's mining and oil sectors, and Maduro agreed to hold elections in 2024. The deal quickly crumbled after the Venezuelan Supreme Court barred Washington's two preferred candidates from running in the election, and sanctions were reimposed. U.S. oil giant Chevron was granted a license in 2022 to do business with Caracas. However, the total sanctions regime against the Venezuelan economy has limited the impact of that venture. While Trump leveled charges of election rigging against Maduro to justify canceling the Chevron deal, he added that Caracas was not accepting deportation flights from the U.S. at a fast enough pace. So he wrote, additionally, the regime has not been transporting the violent criminals that they send into our country, the good old U.S. of A., back to Venezuela at a rapid pace that they had agreed to do, the president wrote on Truth Social. So shortly after Trump returned to the White House in January, crisis envoy Rick Grenell met with Maduro and secured the release of 6 Americans. Maduro also agreed to accept Venezuelan nationals deported from the United States. Maduro viewed the meeting with Grenell as an opening to improve ties with Washington. However, Secretary of State Marco Rubio then traveled to the Dominican Republic and seized Maduro's plane, alleging the aircraft was used to violate American sanctions, and pretty much quashing our hopes that we are going to see an improvement in the relationship between the U.S. and Russia. All right, now moving on to the war in Ukraine. Trump says Ukraine can forget about joining NATO. So this is a good statement here. President Trump said on Wednesday that Ukraine could forget about joining NATO and that the country's potential membership in the alliance was likely the reason the war started. When asked about what concessions he would like to see for a peace deal, he said, NATO, you can't forget about it. I think it's probably the reason the whole thing started. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth already ruled out the idea of Ukrainian NATO membership as a part of any potential peace deal. The Trump administration's position is a significant shift from the Biden administration, which consistently promised Ukraine would eventually join NATO and even called the Russian invasion unprovoked. Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, who has been involved in the negotiations with Russia, recently acknowledged that the invasion was provoked and said that it doesn't necessarily mean that it was provoked by the Russians. In the months leading up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. and Russia engaged in negotiations, but the Biden administration refused to address Moscow's concern over many key issues, including the possibility for Ukrainian NATO membership. Shortly after the invasion, Zelensky was told privately by the U.S. that he wouldn't be joining NATO. So this is, a quote from Zelensky. He said, I requested them personally to say directly that we are going to accept you into NATO in a year or 2 or 5. Just say it directly and clearly, or just say no. And the response was very clear. You're not going to be a NATO member, but publicly the door will remain open. And of course, I just want to really emphasize how sick this policy was, because while we were claiming at the same time that, we're doing this for Ukraine because of Ukrainian sovereignty, because we love the Ukrainians, because the Russians are evil. Really, the Americans were evil. Really, this policy was about provoking Russia to invade Ukraine and then keeping Russia fighting in Ukraine. Why? Because we saw that as weakening Russia, as making Russia weaker, and that being an advantage to the United States of America. It didn't matter to Washington that the Ukrainians were suffering massive losses, that they were going to lose 20% of their country, that they were going to lose key resources and cities would be destroyed and children would be orphaned. Forget all that. None of that mattered to Washington. That Russians were bleeding and dying on the front lines, even at much smaller numbers to the Ukrainians, was seen as a victory by Washington because ultimately Ukraine does not matter. Only the idea of taking Russia down a notch did. Absolutely sick. All right. So next up here, House Foreign Affairs Chair tells staff to refer to Israeli-occupied West Bank as Judea and Samaria. So Representative Brian Mast, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who previously volunteered in the IDF, has ordered committee staff to refer to the Israeli-occupied West Bank as Judea and Samaria, a biblical name used by the State of Israel to refer to the Palestinian territory. According to Axios, in a memo to 50 Republican staffers, Mast wrote that in recognition of our unbreakable bond with Israel and the inherent right of the Jewish people to their ancient homeland, the House Foreign Affairs Committee will, from here forward, refer to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria in formal correspondence, communication, and documentation. Mast is one of Israel's staunchest supporters in Congress, which he demonstrated when he wore an IDF uniform to Capitol Hill in October of 2023. At the time, he wrote on X, "As I was the only member to serve with both the United States Army and the Israeli Defense Forces, I will always stand with Israel." Mast's order to Republican staffers came amid a major Israeli operation in the West Bank dubbed Iron Wall, which has involved the forcible displacement of 40,000 Palestinians, the destruction of roads, homes, and other infrastructure, and the killing of civilians, including pregnant women and children. Israel Defense Minister Israel Katz has said that displaced Palestinians cannot return home, signaling a new ethnic cleansing campaign has begun. The Israeli government has made expanding illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank a priority, with the goal of ultimately annexing the territory. Now, they do want to annex the territory. However, they want to kick the Palestinians off of the territory first because they want to have a Jewish state. And the problem is they want to draw the borders of their Jewish states around territory that would make Jews not the majority in the Jewish state. And so in order to keep their Jewish state with a territory that what includes a lot of non-Jews, they plan to drive the non-Jews off of their homeland. And, this whole idea that they have an ancestral, a biblical right to this land that other people currently live on is just, the dumbest thing, but it is U.S. policy. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for the 26th. Trump removes Biden-era order that linked arms transfers to humanitarian aid. So President Joe Biden issued a national security memorandum last year that required all countries that receive U.S. military assistance not to impede humanitarian aid distribution. President Donald Trump has now rescinded that order. In February of 2024, President Biden issued a national security memo that said American military aid would be linked to compliance with international law. While the executive order was largely redundant, as the Leahy laws prohibit U.S. arms transfers to countries that commit war crimes, the memorandum was viewed as a way to push Israel to allow more assistance into Gaza. The order proved ineffective in getting Tel Aviv to shift policy of intentionally creating humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. Following the executive memo, leaked documents from USAID showed the agency concluded that Israel was still blocking aid from moving into the Strip. In May of 2024, Secretary of State Antony Blinken explained that while Israel was blocking aid, Tel Aviv gave assurances to Washington that were credible and reliable, so to allow the provision of defense articles to continue. The Washington Post reported viewing a February 21st order from National Security Advisor Mike Waltz that rescinded Biden's national security memo. The order proved ineffective as aid deliveries into Gaza did not meet minimum requests from the international aid organizations of about 500 trucks per day. Sarah Yeager, a Washington director of the advocacy group Human Rights Watch, said the memo wouldn't have been necessary if the Biden administration had followed U.S. laws on arms transfers, and said, so my question for the Trump team is, will you show the American people that you will abide by U.S. law when sending weapons to allies? And my guess is the answer to that question is no, but her statement is interesting in that it really lays out that while this memo was unneeded, it does suggest that the Trump administration is just going to take the gloves off of Israel even more than the Biden administration did, which they essentially just let Israel commit genocide in Gaza. So, as I've been explaining over the past 6 weeks, Israel is trying to keep the ceasefire deal limited to phase 1 and not allow it to enter phase 2. And it seems Netanyahu's newest idea for that is saying that Israel isn't going to withdraw from the Gaza-Egypt border, known as the Philadelphia corridor. And I think the idea is that this is going to cause the negotiations that are currently ongoing in Egypt between Israel and Hamas about going from phase 1 to phase 2 of the ceasefire agreement from happening. I do highly suspect that we are not going to reach phase 2 of this ceasefire. Right now, the U.S. is pushing to extend phase 1 of the ceasefire deal. I'm not sure if that's going to happen or not. Something tells me that Hamas may go along with it for a week or two, but it seems that Israel's goal is really to get all the hostages out, or at least most of them out, and then go back to the fighting in Gaza, and they have no intention of actually ending the conflict. Next up here, this one, Dave DeCamp, February 27th, antiwar.com. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich to visit the U.S. Dave writes, one of the more extreme members of the Israeli government will travel to Washington in the coming days to meet with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. His visit could have significant implications for U.S. policies towards Israel's goal of annexing the West Bank, as that is one of Smotrich's main goal, to annex the West Bank. It says something that he thinks Trump and Netanyahu are both on board with. All right, last up here today, this article I wrote for the Institute on the 27th. IDF report on October 7th identifies several Israeli failures. And just want to remind you all that if you want to continue, make sure that we continue to produce journalism like this at the Institute, head on over and donate to our fundraisers. There's a great list of kickbacks, including Scott Horton's book Provoked. You could get a signed copy of that. All right, so I write here, an inquiry by the Israeli Defense Forces into the October 7th Hamas attack identified several failures by the military. Many of the results of the investigation had previously been reported. The probe found that the Israeli military only had one drone flying over Gaza on October 7th and no fighter aircraft ready to respond to Hamas in southern Israel. The lack of military hardware in the region prevented the IDF from more quickly expelling the Hamas invaders. The lack of aircraft prepared to engage with Hamas was a result of the incorrect Israeli assessment that the Palestinian resistance group was unwilling to engage the IDF in a large-scale war. This is not the first Israeli inquiry to conclude that Tel Aviv downplayed the threat posed by Hamas before October 7th. The IDF continued to struggle to repel the Hamas assault even after it began. Once planes were able to get in the air, the IDF ordered some to guard critical infrastructure in Israel or to monitor the northern border in case of a Hezbollah attack. Additionally, some pilots were hesitant to open fire because Israelis could be killed along with members of Hamas. Hence, the attack on southern Israel, the IDF ordered the Hannibal Directive. The directive orders Israeli forces to fire on Israeli captives to prevent them from becoming hostages of the enemy and thus being used as bargaining chips. Hamas rockets fired in the early hours of the attack overwhelmed Tel Aviv's missile defense system, and some air bases were hit, leading to further delays in the IDF responding to Hamas attacks. The inquiry focused solely on the actions of the IDF. The Times of Israel notes that Israel political decisions were not examined in order to avoid a fight with government leaders. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has insisted that the investigation must wait until after the fighting in Gaza is over. And of course, That's likely because it will be discovered that Netanyahu's policies of propping up Hamas and essentially using Hamas as an excuse to never engage in negotiations on a future Palestinian state was a part of the Israeli policy for 2 decades under his rule, and certainly led to what happened on October 7th, and he bears a large part of that responsibility. And so part of the reason that Netanyahu can't let the fighting in Gaza come to an end is because then people will start to question his role in all that, which he hopes to avoid. All right, everybody, that'll do it for the show this week. Hope you all enjoyed the show and you caught some episodes of the Kyle Anzalone show as well. We'll be back with more content next week. Thanks, everyone.